I grew up in a home with two alcoholic parents in Sydney, and I suffered a series of traumas as a young person, which included being bullied for many years at school, a sexual assault by a pedophile when I was on holidays, witnessing my mum being electrocuted, and she came back to life, but that just left such an impact and a terrible fear in me of losing people close to me. And at 10, I was put under the care of a psychiatrist because I had a breakdown, and that was kind of my start to the mental health journey, I guess. My dad had chronic PTSD because he was brought up in a home with two alcoholic parents. His mother was extremely violent, and his dad was actually a very well-known musician at the Tivoli and was out at nights. And my dad would often have to lock himself in his room because his mother would come in with knives and stuff like that. The amount of times he came home from school to see her passed out as a primary school student, had to ring the ambulance, and things like that were just too many to count. So my dad taught me to fear everything. So I was like born into fear. And there's research towards the fact that post-traumatic stress can be passed on through the genes. And I really believe that I probably inherited that from what he went through. But I started to live in this terrible fear and hopelessness after my mum and dad took me to the police after the sexual assault on holidays. And it ended up being the son of the owner of the holiday cabins. And back in those days, you didn't give a credit card, you gave your name, address, and phone number. So they knew where we lived. And because of that fact, I was catapulted into a world of terror, even though we were going back home the next day, packing up and just leaving on my brother's 8th birthday. I knew that that person knew where I lived. And so then that started this terrible set of events where I never felt safe in my home from that point on. We lived on a 4-lane highway, and I was absolutely convinced that this person was going to track me down and kill me. So I started to develop these rituals, as we talked about, and you've shared in your story, thinking that, you know, if I did these things, for instance, like there was 5 members of my family, if I had a biscuit or something, I'd have to have 5. I'd tap things all the time. Everything I did had to be in 5s to represent each member of the family. And I'd think that if I only did 4, something would happen to one of the family. And I was tormented by fear and terror. And there was no haven at home because I felt so unsafe, and then no haven at school because I was bullied. So I was prescribed anti-anxiety medication and antidepressant medication at 10, and I became addicted to that because I just wanted an escape from the demons in my head. There was just no turning off what was going on up here, no peace. I'd have a lot of times of happiness and joy in our family unit because even though my mum was still an active alcoholic then, we still had a lot of great family times, and I was very loved by my parents. But that happiness was always overshadowed by the fear and terror and knowing that the nighttime was coming and I probably wouldn't be sleeping. So the nights were the worst. And it's very interesting because as a counsellor today, so many people that I see come to me in middle age, and it's always as a result of unresolved childhood trauma. And so I think what happens is people just lock that stuff away and they don't deal with it, and it stays in. It's got to go somewhere, and then it just resurfaces later on in life. And what we do is we normalize what's going on because we don't know any different. So I didn't really realize, I felt very different from the rest of the world. And I was born into alcoholism as well. 4 members of my own family were alcoholics, my grandparents. And I can remember never feeling like I fitted in, always feeling like everyone was staring at me and like a raw exposed nerve, really. So pills took that away. And then as soon as I could at 15, I took my first drink of alcohol, and it just obliterated everything. And I thought, this is what I need to get through life. It made me feel normal, took away all the anxiety, all the fear, and just blotted everything out. So that was kind of what I was after from that point, was obliteration from reality, something to give me the ability to communicate with other people, because without alcohol, I felt like I couldn't have a conversation with anyone. And I remember, it's just come to me now, that my self-esteem was so low that was one of the reasons why I couldn't communicate with people. And I remember walking down the street when I was working in the city of Sydney, and I would always walk with my head down because the fear of looking at someone in the eyes was really big for me. And I had my head down, and I actually walked into a taxi that slammed its brakes on. So I almost got run over that day. But because I walked with my head down all the time, I didn't want to look at people. I felt totally unworthy, worthless, useless, no self-esteem whatsoever. I hated myself. And I hated myself because I felt like everyone else hated me. Being bullied at school and then being assaulted by somebody, it sent messages to me that I was damaged and that something was wrong with me. So I just sought total oblivion from that. And my alcoholism escalated really quickly. Within about 3 to 6 months of starting drinking, everybody in my life, my boyfriend, my parents, all my parents' friends that were in AA, so I actually didn't really get a good shot at drinking because I had all the sober alcoholics on my back saying, you've got a problem, you need to give up drinking. And I'm like, I'm only 16. I'm just starting. My life's just beginning, and how could I have a problem? But I guess my story is a real message to anybody out there, to any parent who thinks that their kid's too young to have a problem, and to any person who's struggling with addiction. And in my line of work, I see so many young people today who are struggling with addiction, but they think they're too young. Nobody's too young to actually give this attention and stop. And Mum and Dad took me to an AA meeting when I was 16 years old.
Wow.
And in that meeting, thinking everyone was ancient and they were probably about the age I am now, but they'd point to me and they'd say, I wish I found this when I was your age, this young girl in the room. Because if I did, I wouldn't have lost my family. I wouldn't have murdered that person. I wouldn't have ended up in jail. I wouldn't have ended up in a psych ward. I wouldn't have lost everything. I wouldn't have lost my children. And those words just rang in my ears, to think that it was a warning. And I'd hear horror stories in those rooms when I went just to appease my parents. But in the back of my mind, I thought something's just really not right with me. And if I ever do need help, I know that this will be the place to come because there are other people struggling with alcohol. And I couldn't work out why I'd only set out to have 2 drinks, but I would end up paralytic every time and wake up on people's fences in the middle of nowhere with strangers in strangers' beds. And I never ever knew how it happened, how I got there. All I knew was I'd set out to have a couple of drinks that night before, and there's many things that I can't remember. And I was recently giving this a lot of thought last year only because I still have flashbacks from the past and I can never put the pieces back together again. And I came up with this saying that for a recovering alcoholic or addict, life is like an unsolved jigsaw puzzle, one of which you can never, ever put the pieces back together again. But something wonderful, though, about that is that you can make a new jigsaw puzzle. And that's what I'm able to do out of my life. So at 18, everything became so hopeless. I'd been in violent relationships, other things had happened to me. I'd experienced multiple traumas while drunk, and I hit total rock bottom. And I thought, I can't live anymore. I don't know how to live anymore. And I would like to give a warning now about suicide. But that day I decided to end my life. And right then at that moment, I heard a loud voice say, don't do it. If you hang on a bit longer, you'll find happiness one day. And I'd been brought up with a faith, but I wasn't walking in that faith. But I really believed that day that was the voice of God giving me second chance. And that day I rang Alcoholics Anonymous, and it was the place to go. I knew that it was my last stop. If it didn't work, I was out of here. I had no hope left. And the truth is, for many people that feel like they're so hopeless that they want to end their life, they don't actually want to die. They just don't know how to live anymore. And that was how I got to. So through the 12-step program, I learned new strategies on how to live my life, how to find meaning, how to find purpose, how to forgive myself and forgive others, how to find gratitude, how to find a new set of connections, and finding like-minded people who understood the trauma that I'd been through was just life-saving. That feeling of loneliness and being alone in a crowd even I still struggled with it, but knowing that other people felt the same way as that was really life-saving for me, and I think that went on to be a catalyst for me to start Stories of Hope down the track.